Chapter 6 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 6. If It Could Have Been. Hubert Urquhart arrived 3 days after Mountford's establishment at Ellerslie, by which time the stranger had made himself at home in his new surroundings, had explored gardens and park under Marie's guidance, had seen a coal mine and an iron mine, had become very good friends with Sir Joseph, and had won the approval of Sir Joseph's head keeper. Urquhart's arrival was no more welcome to Braddon than it was to Marie Arnold. The old acquaintance was civil to the newcomer, but was evidently displeased at finding a stranger domesticated at Ellerslie. The more so, perhaps, when he heard that the stranger was a connection of Sir Joseph's and had a legitimate claim upon his hospitality. Mr. Urquhart was 34 years of age, and had been in a cavalry regiment, and had sold out just before the abolition of purchase in the army. He had married badly, as Sir Joseph told Braddon, had married in haste, and repented with equal celerity. He had not been unkind to his wife, but he had been neglectful, and even his battered conscience had felt some remorseful twinges when the poor faded prettiness which had once been so purely pink and white faded out of life altogether suddenly after the birth of a second baby, which only survived the mother by a fortnight. She died at the Yorkshire parsonage in which the greater part of her life had been spent, and where her orphan daughter, Cora Lee, was now being cared for by a widowed grandfather and 2 spinster aunts. Those remorseful pangs of conscience for a wife from whose deathbed he had been absent did not long discompose the gentlemanlike equanimity which was a mark of race in Hubert Urquhart. He went back to his patrimonial home, a free man, and took his ease in the house of his elder brother, Lord Penrith, still a bachelor, and burdened with an estate richer in acreage and historical interest than in revenue. The Penriths had been poor for 3 generations and were getting poorer as land declined in value. Lord Penrith had just missed 3 great heiresses, having tried his hardest for all 3, and having been near acceptance with each. There was something wanting in his nature, where women are concerned. The cold hardness of the Urquhart character might have subjugated some meek, sentimental girl whose dream of love is of upward-looking, worshipping affection, the love of the brooks for the moon. But heiresses have got beyond that kind of sentimentalism. They require to be worshipped themselves, and the more exacting among them require sincerity in the worshipper. Lord Penrith had never been able to even seem sincere, and in each case he found finally that he had but made the running for some hot-headed, impetuous lover who was able to put a little heart into the courtship. Crushed by his 3rd disappointment, Penrith had retired to his Cumbrian castle and into himself, and already bore the reputation of a misanthrope and a woman-hater. He had almost abandoned the hope of restoring the fortunes of his race by a wealthy alliance. The Anglo-American marriage, the strictly modern blend of the feudal castle and the transatlantic oil well, had hardly come into fashion at that time, and Lord Penrith, having failed to attach himself to English coin in the possession of English beauty, retired to his tent like Achilles and sulked there, content to shoot and fish and hunt and farm, remote from society and woman's wiles. He was Hubert Urquhart's senior by 5 years, a man of graver character, but of the same hardness of fibre. Hubert had a kind of surface pleasantness which served his turn in society and which made him more popular than his elder brother. The Urquharts were a handsome race, always allowing for that hardness of expression which was a family characteristic. Penrith and his brother were both tall, strongly built, yet slender, with commanding carriage and a thoroughbred delicacy of hand and foot. Both had the Scottish type of features and complexion, long, thin noses, thin lips, and cold grey eyes, and auburn hair, and they were men who looked their best in Highland clothes, which made up by the picturesque for what was wanting in the wearers in personal charm. Hubert Urquhart's keen grey eye scanned Braddon from head to foot, weighed him in the balance, and found him wanting as a man of the world. "I am told you have spent half your life in Africa, Mountford," he said, in a pause of their sport, as they sat on the river bank discussing a snack of bread and cheese and a bottle of Bass. "Not quite. My life has lasted 26 years, of which 5 have been spent in Africa." "Why did you go?" Brandon's brow clouded at the question. "I had been ill, and my doctor told me to live in the open air." "You could have done that in Argyllshire or Connemara." "No doubt, but I preferred Mashonaland." "Curious fancy," said Urquhart with a slightly contemptuous air. "I have never yet been able to realise the motives of a man who runs away from civilization, unless he is running away from debts and difficulties at the same time, which of course was not your case. And you really found the Crocodile and the Zambesi rivers more attractive than the Rhine or the Arno?" "Infinitely more attractive. I grant that the European rivers have all the charm of association, that there are some names, Tiber for instance, which act like a spell, but that untrodden world yonder has what the civilized world has not, freshness and mystery." "Ah, you hanker after the unexplored and the unknown. My ideal is a place like Monte Carlo, where there are good hotels, pretty women, and a 30 et 40 table, to say nothing of pigeon shooting. I've never been further afield for pleasure than southern Italy, and I hope never to go. What do you think of Old Higginson?" "A splendid old man. Plenty of grit and plenty of heart. A sturdy old Briton, ain't he? Distinctly native production. The kind of man we all pretend to be proud of, and of whom we all laugh at." I have not yet discovered the ridiculous side of his character. Ah, you are a connection, and you think it a point of honour to take the good old bloke seriously. I am indebted to him for infinite hospitality. I like his house, his shooting, his river, and I like him. But for all I can't help seeing that he is a capital joke. His frank boastfulness, for instance, his missing aspirates, his prosy recapitulation of the various steps by which he mounted fortune's ladder. The worst of such men is they can take nothing for granted. Everything in their lives must be expatiated upon. I like his frankness, and I don't mind his bragging, which is a part of his frankness. Oh, come now, Mountford. Hang frankness. Call it frank egotism. Candour is only a synonym for want of manners. Your candid man goes about the world plaguing everybody with his own feelings and his own affairs. The first lesson a well-bred man learns is that the art of self-suppression, and that the outside world doesn't care twopence whether he's alive or dead. What is your opinion of Sir Joseph's handsome niece, ward, or whatever you like to call her? You have just told me that reticence is a sovereign merit in civilized man, and yet you question me about my opinions. Opinions are always interesting. Marie Arnold is a handsome woman. We are both men and are both mortal. We can hardly help admiring her. You have expressed an opinion that serves for both of us. There is nothing left for me to say. You think her handsome, then? Questioned Urquhart with keen eyes bent upon his companion. Of her type, most assuredly. But you don't care for the type, evidently. I confess that there is a little too much prodigality in form and colouring for my ideal. That southern splendour dazzles me more than it attracts. The type I most admire is of a paler beauty. There is an ethereal Raphaelesque fairness, which is, to my mind, the perfection of loveliness. You are thinking of your cousin, I fancy, said Urquhart, still keenly watching of his companion's face. Of my cousin? Oh, you mean Miss Higginson, perhaps. I have never seen her, but her portrait as a child does certainly realise my ideal, allowing for the disadvantages of that nondescript age, which face and form have lost the charm of infancy without acquiring the grace of girlhood. But how is it that you've never seen her before? There's no how about the matter. No reason why I should have been here sooner, or why I should have come at all, except the stream yonder. My connection with Ellerslie is of the slightest. My father and Lady Lucy were a kind of distant cousins, and Miss Higginson and I are just one stage further apart on the family tree. If you look at the Mountford pedigree, you will find my name in an obscure bracket near the edge of the document, while Miss Higginson, as granddaughter of the present Lord Allendale, occupies a central position. Miss Higginson is a personage anywhere and everywhere, a great heiress and a great beauty, after your Raphaelesque type. The beer bottles were empty by this time, and the soothing digestive pipe was finished. So the two men went back to the river, and for the rest of the day were better occupied than in idle conversation. Perhaps Urquhart had asked all the questions he wanted to ask, yet he tramped back to Ellerslie House in a somewhat discontented mood, for being himself innately insincere, he found it difficult to credit anybody else with sincerity. Pretends not to like her, he mused, as he and Braddon walked up the hill between 4 and 5 o'clock after a disappointing day. I never knew a man who did not depreciate the woman he was in love with. They like to throw another man off the scent, even when there is no particular reason for concealment. It was one of those halcyon days which April steals from May or June, and they found Sir Joseph taking tea on the terrace, with Marie ministering to his comforts, buttering his thin, dry toast, and measuring out the precise amount of cream he liked in his cup. The old man was basking in the afternoon sunshine, basking also in the sense of well-being, of a life profitably spent, of a great fortune honourably acquired, of the power which wealth gives when that wealth is realised out of the thews and sinews of working men, and when a whole population depends for its bread upon one man. At a nod of Sir Joseph's head, those villages yonder, scattered on the bleak moorland, might be reduced to idleness and penury. He had been, upon the whole, a beneficent employer. He had never forgotten that he once worked for his bread, or that his mother had risen at 5 o'clock on winter mornings to go out washing, and that his sympathy with working men and women had never been lessened by his own luxurious surroundings. He knew as well what they wanted now as he knew what he wanted 50 years ago when he was one of them. The link between him and his people had never been broken. When there were strikes and lockouts over half England, Sir Joseph's peace was unthreatened. His men laughed trade unionists to scorn. They wanted no socialist friends from Newcastle or Shields. They had the best friend they could have in old Joe, and so long as old Joe was above ground, they would work for him and trust him. He had made it the study of his life to be in advance of his men's necessities, and to concede advantages unasked that were soon afterwards being fought for with murderous rancour in other districts. Little wonder, then, that Sir Joseph Higginson's influence was rooted deep in the hearts of his people. His young wife's brief residence at Ellerslie had been a reign of beneficence, and it had been Sibyl's delight to continue the good work her mother had begun. So the voice of the socialist charm he never so wisely was powerless to arouse evil feeling among the men of Ellerslie. The salmon fishers were received with cordiality by Sir Joseph, and with a certain mute emotion by Marie Arnold, who blushed at their coming, blushed as she never had done when Urquhart came alone. He himself noted with sullen jealousy there was evidently a flirtation on foot already between Braddon and her, and Braddon's indifference was only an assumption, Urquhart told himself as he drew his chair to the tea table and watched Marie as she poured out tea for the new arrivals. He marked her lowered eyelids, those full, firm eyelids, which had a look of marble above their dark lashes. He noticed the tremulous uncertainty of her hands as they moved among the cups and saucers. Yes, this newcomer had made a deeper impression upon her foolish little mind in 3 days than he, Urquhart, had made in all his lengthy visits, and with all his subtlest flatteries and most delicate attentions. He had hated Mountford from the outset as a dangerous interloper, and now he was assured that he had not hated him without cause. Hubert Urquhart had fallen in love with Marie Arnold on his first visit to Ellerslie, a 3 months widower, but he had been careful to give no indication of his feelings. He had been studiously courteous, and he had ventured on an occasional compliment, but he had gone no further, waiting to be sure of his ground before he declared himself. From the beginning, he had made up his mind that Marie Arnold was nearer and dearer to Sir Joseph than the old man had told the world. His casual way of talking of her, sometimes as the daughter of a man who had been killed in his service, sometimes as a kind of adopted niece, did not deceive Mr. Urquhart. He saw that Sir Joseph was as proud of Marie's beauty and accomplishments as he was of Sibyl's more refined attractions, and that his eyes turned as fondly upon the alien when the 2 girls stood beside his chair bidding him good night as ever they turned upon his acknowledged daughter. Urquhart had no doubt that Marie too was his daughter, the issue of some intrigue which had lightened the cares of his work in the Belgian mining country, and it occurred to him that even an unacknowledged daughter of Sir Joseph Higginson would be no bad match for the impecunious scion of a noble house. He was cautious, however, and went to work deliberately, although he was deeper in love with Marie Arnold than he had ever been with any woman in his life. It may be that there was something in the warmth and quick impulse of her southern nature which charmed him by contrast with his own cold and sluggish temperament. Ice and fire could not have been more different, but the ice trembled and melted at the touch of that fire, and the hard, battered man of the world owned himself the slave of this unsophisticated girl. Festina lente, he said to himself. I can't afford to marry her unless there's money in it. He had heard a good deal about a certain Andrew Orlebar, Sir Joseph's factotum, secretary, and alter ego, and he fancied that this Orlebar would be the right man to put him on the right tack. Orlebar must know all about Marie's origin and Marie's expectations. The only question was how much of that information Mr. Orlebar might be disposed to impart in answer to judicious pumping. Heretofore, Mr. Urquhart had been unlucky in finding Orlebar absent from Ellerslie, either watching his chief's business in London or on some continental mission. He was a man who needed no more warning or preparation for a journey to Egypt or India than commoner men require for a trip to Brighton or Paris. He lived, moved, and breathed only for his employer, had neither kith nor kin, tastes nor pleasures of his own, a colourless, faithful, stolid, unenjoying machine, fashioned in the likeness of man. This time Urquhart had taken care to be sure of Orlebar's presence at Ellerslie before he offered himself as a visitor, and here in the glow of the afternoon sunlight came this very Orlebar, shuffling along the terrace, faded, dusky, grey, amid all the wealth of colour in a garden unfolding its beauty to spring. He made a discordant note in that harmony of brilliant hues, a patch of dirty grey which offended the eye. He brought his chief a packet of letters, the afternoon mail, and they two were soon sitting apart, with heads close together and brows bent over the open letters by the marble balustrade, and at the base of a marble pen, which seemed to look down at them in grim derision of their money-grubbing instincts. What did money matter to the great god Pan, the forest wildling, who had all the wealth of nature for his own? Marie questioned the men about their day's sport, and Urquhart noticed how her glances turned shyly to Mountford, and dwelt on his face while he talked, and even lingered there when he was silent. Towards him, Urquhart, she had shown only avoidance, had made all pursuit of her difficult, had been openly scornful when he praised her beauty or seemed to hang entranced upon her singing, seemed only, since music was a missing sense with most of the Urquharts, and for him a barrel organ in a London street playing the latest musical melody, or a brass band in the park braying the last flashy waltz, realised all that music should be. Marie sang her little French songs at Sir Joseph's bidding upon this evening, just as she had sung on previous evenings, and Sir Joseph slept to the music as before. But Mountford perceived a change in her manner. She was less at her ease than she had been when he and she had been practically alone. She was silent in the intervals of her singing, and she retired early. When she was gone, Sir Joseph challenged Mountford to a great game of cribbage, in which the old man excelled, and Urquhart strolled off to the billiard room in quest of Andrew Orlebar, who had dined with him and had disappeared immediately after dinner, neither sharing the after-dinner claret nor the after-dinner cigars. "Curious fellow, Orlebar," explained the master of the house. "He neither smokes nor drinks. He has no vices, and I sometimes think he has no virtues. He is the nearest approach to a calculating machine that a warm-blooded animal could attain to." "And remarkably useful to you, no doubt, Sir Joseph," said Mountford. "Invaluable. The human calculating machine is the rarest product of nature. Your average accountant is distracted by the burden of his own egotism, his passions, domestic anxieties, temptations, proclivities. My friend Orlebar is arithmetic incarnate." Orlebar had a den of his own adjoining the billiard room, by courtesy. Mr. Orlebar's study, in actual appearance an accountant's office, a piece of pigeonholes and ledgers and dockets and files, its most interesting literature a long row of Whitaker's almanacs, sole record of the passing years. The room was conveniently situated for Sir Joseph, who was fond of billiards and liked to run in and out of his secretary's den as occasion prompted. Urquhart took down a cue and amused himself with a few experimental shots, with his eye half upon the half-open door of Orlebar's room. Yes, the grey old man was there. Urquhart heard the scratching of his pen. He went to the door and looked in at the bent shoulders and iron grey head leaning over a page of foolscap. "Can I tempt you to put down your pen and take up a cue, Mr. Orlebar?" he asked. Orlebar looked at him quietly, neither surprise nor gratification expressed on his blunt physiognomy. "I don't play billiards," he said. "I sometimes mark." He drew a sheet of blotting paper over a page of closely ruled columns filled with figures, and left his desk as if ready for conversation. "Oh, don't let me disturb you if you don't care to play." "I have finished my evening's work," answered Orlebar, "and I am going out for my evening constitutional." "What, you walk after dinner, do you?" "Always, Mr. Urquhart, wet or fine. No machine will go on smoothly without oil, and locomotion is the only oil I know of that will keep the human machine in good working order. I walk 6 miles per diem." "Let me walk with you," said Urquhart with a friendly air. "Sir Joseph and Mr. Mountford are at cards. I should like to walk." "Won't it bore you, though, such a walk as I take, and down the terrace so many turns for a mile? It is not the kind of walk a young man like you would care for." Urquhart looked at the dull, grey face before he answered. There was a lurking shrewdness under the surface stolidity of Mr. Orlebar's countenance, which told him that any attempt to conceal his own motives would be worse than useless. It would damage his chances of getting any help in this quarter. "I don't care where I walk as long as I keep you moving," he said, "and I particularly want a little chat with you." "Come along, then," said Orlebar, opening a glass door which gave on to the terrace, and in the next minute he and Urquhart were walking side by side in the misty stillness of a mild April night. "You want to talk to me, you say? You want a tip for the Stock Exchange, no doubt. You've a fancy for some new venture, and you think Andrew Orlebar is up to the deed." "My dear Mr. Orlebar, I am not a speculator." "My dear Mr. Orlebar, I'm not a speculator. For the best of all reasons. I have never had any capital to invest. There are men who speculate without capital, but I am glad that you are not one of those," said Orlebar. "They don't often last. The subject upon which I want to talk to you is one that touches me much nearer than any money question could." "Then it must touch you very near." "It does, for it is an affair of the heart." "And you come to me for an advice in a love affair?" exclaimed Orlov with a dry laugh. That's the oddest idea I've heard for a long time. Do I look like a man to advise a lover how to win his mistress? Frankly, you don't, said Urquhart, echoing his laugh. But in my case, you can give very valuable advice, since the lady I am in love with is a kind of ward of your chief's. Marie Arnold. You are in love with Marie, aren't you? Well, you might make a worse choice. She is a handsome young woman. She has a fine voice. She has been well brought up and has good principles. And she will not be without a dowry, I conclude. Ah, then you are not so deep in love as to leave money out of the question. My good Mr. Orlov, I am a man of the world. I made one foolish marriage, a sweet girl, pure as an angel, but without a rap. I am too old to make a second blunder of the same kind. If I were a rich man, I should be proud to marry Miss Arnold without a penny. But I have only a younger son's portion, and I have a daughter to maintain. Sir Joseph must naturally desire to find a husband for his ward. Oh, why naturally? Because her position in his household is anomalous and must lead to complications now that Miss Higginson is grown up. Why anomalous? Oh, my dear Orlov, you must see the difficulty of the case as clearly as I do, said Urquhart, growing familiar. Here is a beautiful girl who is, and yet is not, a member of Sir Joseph's family. There is no avowed relationship, yet Sir Joseph is evidently as fond of her as of his daughter and heiress. Think of the difference between the positions of those two girls, and consider the bad feeling which that difference must awaken in poor Marie's mind a year or so hence, unless she marries and takes her place in society on the strength of that marriage. Who, with a grain of worldly knowledge, can doubt that her claim upon Sir Joseph's is just as strong as Miss Higginson's? You mean that she is neither more nor less than Sir Joseph's unacknowledged daughter, said Orlov. That is my meaning, my fixed conviction. So let it be, my dear sir, was the bland reply. You know very nearly as much as I do about Miss Arnold. I was sent to a little mountain town in Provence to fetch the young lady at Sir Joseph's bidding. Her mother had died rather suddenly, and she, poor child, was alone and friendless, except for a few good-natured gossips, her dead mother's neighbours, too poor and too insignificant to be much use to her. I brought her to London, and from London dispatched her to Ellerslie, where she has lived ever since. Sir Joseph told me that her father was a clever engineer who was of great assistance to him in the working of an iron mine, and who was killed while in his service. For my own part, I see nothing remarkable in the fact that a man in Sir Joseph's position should show kindness to the widow and orphan of so valuable a servant. That he should show kindness, no, but that he should show and introduce the engineer's daughter into his home and take her to his heart, there I think you will own he oversteps the mark and strains credulity. By the way, how old was Marie at the time of her father's death. She was not born. A posthumous child. Was she born soon after her father's death? I cannot gratify you with such minute details. I have no curiosity on the point, only as a man of the world. You must forgive me if I doubt your chief's account of the transaction. I am so fond of Maria that I should like to know all I can about her parentage, in her interest rather than my own. I could love her no less had she been a beggar's brat. I don't want to entrap her into a marriage that would mean poverty, but if Sir Joseph would make a respectable settlement, a settlement in accordance with his own large means. You have not beaten about the bush with me, and I'll be frank with you, Mr. Urquhart, said Orlebar gravely. You are right in supposing that Sir Joseph considers his ward's position somewhat anomalous, or rather that it may appear so when his daughter comes down to the full blaze of society footlights, while Marie Arnold is left at the back of the stage. I believe I am justified in saying that he would like to see this young person married to a husband whom she could love, and he could approve. With such a husband, he would be disposed to treat liberally upon the question of settlements, and I should say that Miss Arnold's dowry might be anything between 20 and 50,000 pounds. You know, of course, that the larger sum would be as easy a matter to Sir Joseph as the smaller. It would be a question of his own inclination and judgment what amount he should give. Undoubtedly. And do you think he would favour my suit? Apart from the money question, I am not a bad match for a young lady in Miss Arnold's position. I belong to one of the oldest families in Cumberland, and I am heir presumptive to an earldom. Lord Penrith is still a young man, Mr. Urquhart. True, but he is a young man with an old man's habits and ideas, and I don't think he will ever marry. That is a point in your favour, but to be frank with you, I doubt if Sir Joseph would quite approve of your antecedents. His ward would have to be very much in love with you in order to win her guardian's consent to the match. Urquhart's brow contracted at the suggestion. He knew in his heart that Marie Arnold's present feeling for him was nearer dislike than love, and he knew that he would have a hard battle to fight before he could get her to be his advocate with Sir Joseph. His hope had been that Sir Joseph would adopt him as a suitor and force his suit with Marie. He did not despair, however, having seen many cases in which love began with aversion. As for my antecedents, he replied after a longish pause, I don't fancy I have been worse than most young men of family, and having sown a few wild oats, I am all the more likely to settle down as a respectable family man. If I could win such a wife as Miss Arnold, I should have a spur to ambition, and might make my way in the political world. With Penrith's interests and Sir Joseph's, I might be able to achieve a distinguished public position. The aspiration is at least creditable. The best advice I can give you is to win the lady. With her on your side, there might be a chance of victory. Sir Joseph would do much to secure her happiness," concluded Orlov in the friendliest tone, and then within himself he said, "But unless I am vastly deceived in my estimate of his knowledge of character, he will never entrust her happiness to a foxy-haired gentleman of your particular type." While this conversation was being carried on in a perambulatory fashion on the terrace, where the sound of the sea came with an undertone of monotonous melancholy, as if it were the great voice of nature mourning the degeneracy of man, another conversation of which Marie Arnold was the subject was going on in the drawing-room. Sir Joseph played his first 2 games with spirit, but the 3rd game had hardly begun when his attention flagged and his play became careless. "What do you think of my adopted daughter?" he asked abruptly. "I think her a very handsome young woman," Mountford answered easily. "There could be hardly 2 opinions upon that point. She seems as amiable as she is good-looking." "She is," replied Sir Joseph quickly. "There is no seeming in her case. She has lived a good many years under this roof, and no one has ever had occasion to find fault with her. She is a good, dear girl, the daughter of a man who was killed in my service. I deemed it my duty to look after her and her widowed mother, and I have never had cause to repent that I undertook the responsibility. She has lived in this house as Sibyl's friend and companion, and she has never shown the slightest jealousy of my little girl's advantages. I don't want her to find out how great a difference the outside world can make between a great heiress and a young woman who is practically a nobody. I should like to see Marie comfortably married before the end of this year, married to a man she can love, a man who shall be worthy of her love." "There should be no difficulty in finding such a man in the wide circle of your acquaintance, Sir Joseph," said Braddon gravely, without looking up from his cards. He had an uncomfortable feeling that there was some serious intention in this host's discourse, an intention that involved himself. "No, indeed. I know plenty of young men on their promotion, decent fellows enough, to whom a wife with 20,000 or so for her dowry would be like a gift dropped from heaven. But I should like to find a husband of whose antecedents I know more than I can know about a casual acquaintance of the West End or City, a man who comes of good stock, and in whom honour and generous feeling are hereditary qualities. I believe in heredity, Mr. Mountford. My father was a peasant, but he was an honest man, and he could trace his descent from many generations of honest, God-fearing men. We plebeians have our old races as well as you patricians." "I've never doubted that. On the Allendale estate there are peasant families that were settled on the soil before the signing of the Great Charter freed them from their heaviest burdens." The game continued languidly, till Sir Joseph laid down his cards with a thoughtful sigh, took off his spectacles, and leaned back in his chair. "That girl doesn't like Urquhart," he said abruptly. "I wonder whether you noticed the change in her manner to-night?" "Yes, Sir Joseph. I saw that Miss Arnold seemed hardly in her usual good spirits this evening. Has Mr. Urquhart made himself obnoxious to her in any way?" Not to my knowledge. It is only a womanish prejudice for which she can give no reason. I sounded her about him the last time he was here. She doesn't like him. Doesn't know why. Objects to the colour of his hair or the shape of his nose, perhaps. I didn't argue the matter with her, and I shouldn't have had him here again if he hadn't offered himself. It wouldn't have been neighbourly to say no, and here he is. However, if she had liked him ever so well, I should have felt very doubtful about letting her marry him. I have heard some disagreeable stories about his conduct in relation to women. Braddon was silent. He had not been favourably impressed by Lord Penrith's younger brother, but he did not want to injure that gentleman's chances with Marie Arnold, having made up his mind that Urquhart was honestly in love with her. Sir Joseph had questioned him before tonight about his own plans for the future, the scheme of his life which he had made for himself, and Braddon had told his host that he meant to go back to Africa. His future lay there in a wandering life. He had no other ambition, no other desire. The old world of civilization could offer him nothing in exchange for the limitless horizons of the desert and the victories of the practised hunter. Sir Joseph had argued against the foolishness of this idea, and now tonight he took up the thread of a former conversation. I can conceive of no greater waste of life than to tramp about a sandy wilderness and shoot lions with occasional intervals of malarial fever, he said. The life suits me as no other life could, replied Braddon. But have you no tie to bind you to your own country? Have you never been in love? Or have you given your English heart to a blackamoor? Since my boyish passion for my tutor's daughter, a buxom young woman of 29, whom I adored when I wore Eton collars, and to whom I wrote 6-page love letters every week while I was at the university, I have been heart whole, replied Braddon with perfect frankness. Nor does my passion for the land of the Zambesi extend to her living products in the shape of black beauty. I have hitherto been adamant to the charms of the Hottentot Venus. And you are free to fall in love with a handsome woman and marry her. No, Sir Joseph, I am not free to marry, and I shall never marry. You are not free? Do you mean to tell me that you entangled yourself by a foolish marriage when you were a lad, married the young woman of 29, your tutor's daughter? My tutor's daughter was far too wise to reciprocate my boyish flame. She married one of the senior masters and is on the high road to become the wife of a bishop. Yet you say you are not free to marry. There are reasons in my family history which should forbid marriage in my case, Sir Joseph, Braddon answered gravely. And then, as in a vision of the night, there came back upon the old man a fair young face, turned to him in a sunlit room, a sad, pale face, streaming with tears, and a gentle voice telling him a cruel story of marriage and motherhood ending in lunacy. Yes, this young man's mother went out of her mind soon after his birth, and there was a strain of madness in his blood. It was only right that he should live and die unmarried, and yet, but for this cruel bar, what an excellent husband he would have made for Marie. Sir Joseph believed himself as a judge of character, and he had formed a high opinion of Braddon Mountford's rectitude and good feeling, and then he would have liked to have shown kindness to the son of that man whom Lucy Mountford had loved, with a girl's innocent fancy, before he had seen the face of her low-born husband. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 7. Urquhart considers himself ill-used. That suggestion of a possible marriage had stirred the waters of Mara in Braddon Mountford's memory. In every man's mind there is some Mara pool which needs but a breath to disturb its bitter waters. With him the pool lay still and deep. Yet he had an ever-present consciousness that it was there, a silent sorrow, which made his life different from the lives of other young men. The fear of hereditary madness was the shadow that wrapped him round and set him apart from men of his own age and circumstances, and hemmed him in with considerations which but rarely block a young man's pathway. He looked back to-night in the solitude of his bedroom at Ellerslie, with the casements flung open to the soft spring night, and with all the waste of dark waters stretching far away to the distant silvery line that marked the horizon, touched with starlight. He looked back, as he often looked, and remembered his solitary childhood with his father's mother, old Mrs. Mountford, widow of General Mountford, who had fought in Arthur Wellesley's Indian campaign. He remembered that sad childhood, his father away in India, a captain of engineers under Sir Robert Napier, his grandmother, a gloomy woman, evangelical, with pinched means and a bitter sense of disappointment in her only son, despondent alike of the here and the hereafter. He remembered how and when he was between 14 and 15 he had been sent from Wellington College to a house at Highgate to see his dying mother, the mother whose face he had never looked upon within his memory. A lucid or semi-lucid interval had marked the ebbing away of life, and she had entreated to see her son, her baby, as she called him piteously. The tall lad stood beside her bed, holding her wasted hand in his, looking down at her with tearful eyes, and her first impulse had been to repudiate him. "Who is this great boy?" she asked. "Mine was a little baby." The nurse tried to explain to her, but she did not listen to the explanation. She was looking at the boy's face, and that told her more than anything the nurse could say about the years that had gone, the changes made by time. "Yes, yes, you are my boy," she cried. "You have your father's eyes. Where is he? Where is my husband? Why doesn't he come to me? He is very unkind. Everybody is unkind." The lad stayed at the doctor's house until all was over, and saw much of his mother in those last few days, those weary closing hours of life, during which her mind was clearer than it had been in all the melancholy years since her son's birth. From doctor and nurses, the son heard the history of those years of seclusion, her delusions, her fancies, the gleams of reason, the intervals of utter darkness. He saw the rooms in which she had lived, brightly furnished, homelike, comfortable even to luxury, and he understood how the absent husband had cared for his helpless wife, shirking no outlay that could ensure her well-being. He walked in the garden where she had walked, a spacious, old-fashioned garden, where the trees and shrubs and holly hedges had been growing for more than a century, and from which he could see the great city, veiled in its smoke curtain, vague, formless, monstrous. He had walked there full of melancholy thoughts. The poor mother, all his life long, a prisoner within those narrow bounds. No, not quite a prisoner. She had been allowed carriage airings whenever her condition permitted her being taken out of doors, carriage airings in the custody of a madhouse nurse. She had been no better off than a state prisoner at best. Years afterwards, when he saw the rocky island of Sainte Marguerite, and the fortress in which the masked prisoner endured long years of silent solitude, his thoughts went back to the sitting-room at Highgate and the sunny garden above the great, smoke-bound city. Those few days at Highgate made a crisis in Brandon Mountford's youth. He went back to Wellington an altered being, and masters and boys were alike struck with the change which his mother's death had made in him. It was odd that he should take his loss so deeply to heart, they said, since he had seen so very little of his mother, a confirmed invalid. Over Brandon's life henceforth there brooded the shadow of a dark fate. He had talked to the doctor at Highgate, and had pressed him closely upon the question of hereditary lunacy, had inquired into the nature of his mother's malady, and had discovered that the mental flaw had first showed itself in the form of epilepsy, from which she had suffered as a young girl, but having, as it was supposed, entirely outlived the tendency to that terrible disease. She and her parents had kept that dark experience of her girlhood a secret from her husband and his family, an offence which old Mrs. Mountford had never forgiven. Over him, too, hung that horror of possible epilepsy. He brooded on this possibility, and magnified its terrors as only youthful imagination can. He thought of himself as a creature apart from his fellows, marked with the signs of a revolting disease. When the 5th chapter of the 2nd book of Kings was read, he compared himself with Naaman the leper. But alas, the age of miraculous cures was past. There was no river in which he could wash and be free from the tendency that was in his blood, the ghastly heritage from his dead mother. He exaggerated all his boyish ailments, saw in every headache an omen of impending evil. It may have been by reason of these gloomy thoughts, or it may have been because his fears were rightly grounded, and that the fatal tendency was latent in his constitution, that the dreaded evil happened. He was nearly 18 years of age when the first attack occurred. The foul fiend of epilepsy seized upon him one evening in the school chapel, rent and tore him, and left him shattered and weakened, with a dull despair in his heart. Henceforth he knew himself doomed. One after another, these horrible convulsive seizures would tear at brain and body until reason would be wrecked in the struggle, and madness would close the scene. As it had been with his mother, so it would be with him. He gave up all idea of the army. He went to Cambridge, worked hard there, and in his 3 years of university life had only that milder form of epileptic seizure which French physicians call le petit mal, in contradistinction to the severe and convulsive type, or le grand mal. Sometimes in his rooms, with his books open before him, or on the river, the sculls in his hands moving slowly with measured beat, there would be a sudden lapse of consciousness. He would go on rowing, perhaps with a mechanical motion, or the sculls would cease to work and the boat would drift with the stream for a little way, the man sitting there, lost to the world around him, knowing nothing till the slow awakening as from a trance, with the knowledge that he had lost himself, that in those few minutes reason and memory had gone. The consciousness of this malady darkened those days which should have been full of pleasantness, but he managed to take a very creditable degree, to the delight of his father, who enjoyed a year's furlough in his son's society, travelling through France and Italy. At Brindisi, father and son parted. On board a P&O steamer, parted, never to meet again on earth. For, within a few months of his return to India, Major Mountford died of jungle fever, and Braddon was lord of himself and of his small estate. The first use he made of his independence was to shake off the trammels of civilization, and to set his face toward the wilderness. His Cambridge doctor had told him that the best chance of warding off future attacks, and of outgrowing his malady, would be found in a free, adventurous life, sport, travel, under God's sky. Much learning was a thing for him to avoid, nor would he be wise in going to the bar or in taking up medicine as a profession. He stayed at Cambridge and worked for his degree, only to gratify his father. He had no ambition of his own in association with the civilized world. If he was to go through life torn by devils, let the tormentors come upon him in the desert, where there would be none to see him in his agony, or at least no one whose scornful pity could smite him to the quick. His life in the wilderness had been, on the whole, a happy life. His love of sport and adventure had grown and strengthened with the growth of his skill as a marksman and his acumen as an explorer. Not often had his hereditary malady overtaken him in the midst of his wanderings, but he had not been altogether free from such visitations, and he knew that the tendency was still unconquered, an enemy kept at bay for the most part, but not beaten. What assurance had he that epilepsy might not, sooner or later, develop into dementia, as in the case of his mother? Sir Joseph had not even hinted at his idea of Mountfort as a husband for Marie, so there had been no harm done, the old man told himself, as he reflected upon last night's conversation with his guest, while he took his morning walk on the terrace before the 9 o'clock breakfast. Braddon had started for the river some hours before, having risen at dawn, but he and the keeper had gone down to the stream alone, Urquhart pleading a headache as a reason for staying indoors. Marie Arnold appeared on the terrace, looking bright and fresh in her pink cotton frock and black silk apron, soon after 8, and joined Sir Joseph in his walk. "A long letter from Sibyl," said the old man. "She is coming back early next week. Her cough has quite gone, and she is pining for home. You'll be glad to have her back again, won't you, Marie?" "Very glad. Ellerslie is not Ellerslie without her." "And about this time next year she will be getting herself ready for the first May drawing room, and then good-bye Ellerslie and good-bye girlhood," said Sir Joseph with a sigh. "She will be swallowed up alive in the fashionable whirlpool, and you and I will lose our hold upon her." "I am not afraid of that, Sir Joseph. I don't think anything in the world will ever change her." "Well, perhaps you are right. Her mother passed through the ordeal unchanged. She was in the world, but never of it. She was like that young woman old John Evelyn was so fond of, who went dancing through the fiery furnace of court life, play acting and singing and waiting upon the Queen and talking to the King in a society where half the women were unmentionable, and remained a saint to the last. Ah me! Sweet Mrs. Godolphin died in the bloom of her youth and beauty, like my dear wife. Well, Marie, we must reconcile ourselves to the inevitable. Sibyl's schoolroom days are over, and you are no longer a young girl. You must marry, my dear. We must find a good husband for you." "Please don't anticipate fate, Sir Joseph," said Marie with a nervous laugh and a vivid blush. "If Providence means me to marry, the husband will appear in due time, and in the meanwhile I shall be quite content to live my own quiet life here with old Mrs. Morrison, while you and Sibyl are in London." "And you will not think yourself hardly used? You won't think it hard that Sibyl should have all the pleasures the great world can give, while you are buried in this dull country home?" What right have I to envy Sibyl her life? I ought to feel nothing but gratitude for your goodness to my mother and me. If you had made me a servant, I ought to have been contented. Oh, don't, Marie, don't. You pain me when you talk like that. I want you to be happy, independent, assured of a bright future. I want you to feel that you have a claim upon me, a strong claim, that you are as much to me as an orphan niece could be, more than a niece, almost as much as a daughter, added Sir Joseph, his eyes dim with tears. You are all goodness to me. I have had more affection from you than I ever had from my mother, and Sibyl has been all a sister could be. Do you think I am going to complain because her loss is cast in the great world and mine out of it? You are a good girl, and your lot may be happier than hers, perhaps. Who can tell? Life went on very quietly at Ellerslie after this conversation between Sir Joseph and his adopted daughter. But that idea of finding a husband for Marie Arnold was still uppermost in his mind, and he was startled when Hubert Urquhart came to him in his study 2 days later and avowed his affection for Miss Arnold, an affection which he only waited Sir Joseph's consent to declare to the young lady. "What? Have you said nothing to Marie about your feelings?" asked Sir Joseph. "Nothing definite. I may have hinted at the state of the case. It is hardly possible for me to be in her society and not to let her see that I adore her." "And how has she taken your hints or your adoration?" "She is an enigma to me, Sir Joseph. Yet I can but think, if I had your approval, if you showed yourself really in favour of our marriage, she would not look unkindly upon me." "Oh, you think she would not object if I urged your suit? Well, Mr. Urquhart, I'll be frank with you and confess that you are about the last man I would choose as a husband for my adopted daughter. I may as well call her my adopted daughter, for I have all a father's affection for her." "I am assured of that, Sir Joseph," said Urquhart. "But I am at a loss to understand your objection to me as a match for a young lady who, I am informed, is the daughter of a mechanic, and who, therefore, would make some advance in the social scale if she became the wife of an earl's younger son." "Kind hearts are more than coronets," said Mr. Urquhart. "Your lineage is unobjectionable, but I cannot say as much for your character or antecedents." "I may have gone the pace a little," admitted Urquhart, "but I have sown my wild oats." "It's not your wild oats I'm thinking about, so much as the character of the sower," answered Sir Joseph gravely. "I've heard stories of your unkindness and neglect as a husband, Mr. Urquhart, and forgive me if I say that you have not a good character from your last place. I have been told that your wife died of a broken heart." "Then you have been told lies, Sir Joseph. Society seldom forgives a man who marries out of its ranks. I married a country parson's penniless daughter, and Any unhappiness there may have been in her life was the result of circumstances over which I had no control. Were I to marry your adopted daughter, I conclude you would make a settlement which would secure her from the pinch of poverty, and which might help me carve out a career for myself, either in politics or at the bar. I would do much for a man she could love, and whom I could trust," replied Sir Joseph gravely. "No question of money should stand between her and happiness. But, to be frank with you, once more, you are by no means the man I would choose." "I understand," said Urquhart, pale with anger, yet trying to be courteous. "You have made your choice already, perhaps. Mr. Mountford is the man you would prefer?" "Mr. Mountford is out of the question. He is a bachelor by inclination, and is bent upon a roving life in South Africa." "Perhaps, Sir Joseph, after your frank depreciation of my character, I had better pack my portmanteau and leave the salmon to more favoured anglers. I have no right to inflict an unwelcome guest upon your family circle." "Don't talk nonsense, man. I may object to you as a husband for an impulsive, inexperienced girl, but that's no reason why I should turn you out of doors. Stop as long as you like. Only give Marie no more hints of your adoration. I have an idea that she is tolerably heart whole, so far as you are concerned." Urquhart did not order the packing of his portmanteau. The Salmon River was very attractive at this season, and it would not have suited his plans to leave Ellerslie, above all to leave Braddon Mountford master of the situation, for, let Sir Joseph say what he would, Urquhart thought that Mountford's pretensions would be favoured. Mountford's family was as good as his, Urquhart's, and Mountford's antecedents offered no ugly blots to the inquiring eye. He had done well at the university. He had never made himself notorious by riotous living or debt. He had won renown as a fine shot and a sagacious explorer, and had published a record of his travels which had been praised by the critics and appreciated by the public. In such a man as this, Urquhart saw a dangerous rival. He saw, too, that Marie was interested in Mountford, and that it needed but some show of sympathy on his part to win her heart. Here, however, he was puzzled. Mountford seemed careless of charms which kindled Urquhart's warmest feelings. Was this coldness simulated, the mask of some deep design? Or was the man really indifferent? Urquhart watched him closely, and could surprise no touch of tenderness amidst his unvarying courtesy. Yet his own natural bent towards dissimulation inclined him to believe that Mountford was masking his batteries. There are some women who care only for the unattainable, and it might be that Marie thought all the more of Mountford because she had been unable to subjugate him. Urquhart had tried the other plan and had failed ignominiously. Mountford had been nearly 3 weeks at Ellerslie, and seemed to have interwoven himself into the family life. Sir Joseph had taken a cordial liking for him, and it was the old man's hearty kindness which induced him to protract his visit much beyond his original intention. "I don't know what we shall do without you when you leave us," said Sir Joseph. "We shall miss him sadly when he goes, shan't we, Marie?" He did not see Marie Arnold's blush as she bent over the newspaper she had been reading, and he thought her answer was cold and careless. And then he remembered Braddon's determination to remain unmarried, a resolve that was perhaps over-scrupulous, since his mother's malady might have bequeathed no fatal taint to him, and he thought it a merciful dispensation that Marie Arnold should be careless and indifferent. It was after 7 o'clock when Mountford came home that evening. He had been for a lonely ramble over the moor, glad to escape from Urquhart's society, even at the sacrifice of sport. Urquhart's conversation was the essence of worldly wisdom, of the streets streety, and a man who has spent his happiest years in the solitary places of the earth and has communed with God and nature under tropical stars does not much find salt or savour in the gossip of clubs or in the intrigues and money troubles of men about town. "I never knew such a fellow for not being interested in things that interest other men," said Urquhart discontentedly, when one of his choicest anecdotes had fallen flat. "I don't believe you even care for the turf." "Not a jot," answered Braddon. "I admire a racehorse because he is the perfection of blood and speed, not because he can win a cup." "Your indifference makes you very bad company," grumbled Urquhart. "We can't all shoot lions." Today Braddon had bathed his brain and senses in solitude, and he felt all the better for the long ramble and the wild, bleak country. He had seen Callander Castle afar off, tall and grey above the ridge of the moor, and he had wondered idly whether he would ever see it nearer, and what kind of man its owner, Urquhart's eldest brother, might be. And now, in the fading light, he walked up the hill, and by the winding shrubberied road that led to Ellerslie House. A carriage was driving a little way in front of him as he passed the lodge gate. It disappeared at the first turn of the road, and he thought no more of it until he saw it standing before the porch, while a footman busied himself in carrying various articles of luggage, handbags, books, umbrellas, and such small deer, into the hall. From the hall came a sound of voices, and Sir Joseph's strong baritone, and a girlish voice which was like music, so low and sweetly toned. Could it be the daughter of the house? Braddon went into the hall feeling shyer than he had ever been in his life before. In those last days of confidential intercourse in Italy, when the father and son had talked together as man and man, Major Mountford had told his son that pathetic story of a hopeless love, struggled against valiantly and never revealed. The thought that he was going to see the daughter of the woman his father had loved thrilled him strangely. He had been told that Sibyl was like her mother, and it was with a feeling almost of awe that he approached the girl of 18. He remembered an old photograph, grey and faded, a poor little photograph taken on the beach at Bognor by an itinerant photographer. The portrait of a girl in a broad-brimmed hat and an old-fashioned frock, but with, oh, so sweet and delicate a countenance, features so refined in their chiselling, such lovely lines of chin and throat, and such a slender, graceful figure. His father had taken that poor little photograph from his dispatch box. It was on glass, and it had accompanied him all over India without coming to grief, and from the shadowland of death and vanished years the young face had looked at Braddon dimly, like a ghost. Yes, there were the same features, the same gracious lines, the same soft depth in the dark grey eyes that were looking at him now. "Hello, Mountford!" cried Sir Joseph gaily. "The master of the house has come home. No more lax behaviour now. We shall have our mind to our manners. Come and be introduced to my tyrant." Sibyl held out her hand in the frankest, friendliest way. "I am ever so much obliged to you for helping to keep father in good spirits," she said. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 8. Dreaming and Waking. Life at Ellerslie took a new colour for Brandon Mountford after that day. It had been pleasant, easy, unconventional from the beginning. He had felt the cordiality of Sir Joseph's welcome, the assurance that his presence gave pleasure to his host, but these things made an everyday happiness, and there was nothing wonderful or dreamlike in a well-found country house, a fine salmon river, and a cheery old man who had become his ascent to Fortune's temple on the lowest rung of the ladder. Sibyl's coming had changed the country house into an enchanted palace. The wind-blown terrace and lawns and shrubberies overlooking the bleak Irish Sea into an earthly paradise. Her coming had changed life into a lovely dream. Her light figure moving to and fro on the rough banks of the river transformed that stream into a magical watercourse leading to an unexplored Eden. When a boating expedition was proposed one day, he almost expected to find the boat drifting into the azure light of caverns as blue as the vast blue vault at Capri. He expected anything wonderful and abnormal rather than the rude grey hills and the barren moorland. In the beginning he surrendered himself blindly to the enchantment of this girl's society. He knew that he could never think of himself or be thought of by Sir Joseph as a possible husband for this heiress of mines and millions. Sir Joseph had frankly stated his ambitious hopes for his daughter. "She must marry a peer, my dear Mountford," he said. "I want her to rise to the sphere which her mother left me when she stooped to marry me. I want to see her a countess before I die. She is pretty enough, and she will be rich enough to be a duchess if there were an eligible duke. I won't marry her to a fortune-seeker or a profligate, Mountford. I may be ambitious, but I won't sacrifice my girl's happiness, even to make her a peeress." All this had been said more than once before Sibyl's return, and all this Mountford had accepted as inevitable, a decree of destiny, since Sir Joseph was the kind of man to carry out his own ideas to the letter, and it would be hard if among the bachelor peers of Great Britain a worthy as well as a titled husband could not be found for his heiress. Mountford knew himself out of the running. "Were I a duke, and the inheritor of a couple of shires, I should be just as ineligible as I am now," he thought. "Nothing would ever induce me to link my life with a dearer life, and blight the heart that loved me." Having thus made up his mind about himself, having set himself resolutely on the side of the celibates, Braddon Mountford made the mistake which men are apt to make in such circumstances. He was too secure of himself. He thought that he might reckon in advance of the greybeard time, and think of himself as a middle-aged, unimpressionable misogynist, while he was still in the very morning of life, much fresher in heart and brain than the majority of young men, since he had never blunted his feelings in the mill-round of youthful dissipations, had not wasted the first fervent love of boyhood upon the sirens and sylphs of the music-halls or the dancing-club, had not been spoiled or wearied by the vacuity and parrot speech of the modish young lady who is by way of being sporting or fast. To Braddon Mountford, an English girl in the morning of her youth was almost a new creation. Had Aphrodite herself met him in some cavern of that bleak shore, in the half-life of daybreak, she could not have seemed more enchanting than Sibyl in the grace and purity of her unspoiled girlhood. He yielded unresistingly to the charm of her presence, accepted her friendly advances, telling her lightly that she was to think of him as a newly discovered poor relation, something of the nature of an uncle. "You might as well call me Uncle, Miss Higginson," he said one day, as he was assisting Sibyl and Marie not to catch salmon. They had taken a good many lessons in the art of throwing a fly, but had not yet achieved the distinction of a bite. "Oh, I couldn't possibly do that," Sibyl answered decisively. "You are much too young for an uncle. I will call you cousin, if you like, though perhaps even that would sound foolish. But we are a kind of cousins, aren't we?" "Yes, we are cousins in the third degree." "I'm glad of that. I like to know that I am related to you. Father likes you so much, quite as well as if you were his nephew. Please call me Sibyl in the future. Miss Higginson is dreadfully formal, and it's such an ugly name." It was agreed, therefore, that they were to call each other Braddon and Sibyl. "We are actually cousins," Sibyl explained the first time she uttered the visitor's Christian name in her father's hearing. "So it would be absurd to go on mistering and missing each other." The speech was so frankly spoken that Sir Joseph took no alarm at the idea. He, too, had accepted Braddon Mountford as a harmless bachelor cousin. He had met dozens of such young men in society, young men as harmless and often as necessary by reason of their helpfulness in all the minor details of domestic life as the often quoted cat. He had no idea that such an existence could menace his dearest hopes. The time came too soon for Brandon's peace, after 10 or 12 days of unalloyed bliss, when the young man knew his own peril. He knew that he loved Sibyl with the love that means the happiness or misery of a lifetime, or at least of all life's best years. There may be healing for such a wound, but it is a cure so gradual and so tardy that the convalescent hardly knows whether the passing years have conquered his passion or worn out his heart. He knew that he loved her, knew that his delight in her society was something stronger and deeper than a man's pleasure in the company of a lovely and fascinating girl, knew that the lightest touch of her hand thrilled him, and that the sound of her voice, heard casually from the garden while he was writing a letter by the open window of his own room, would set his heart beating and make him write nonsense. They had been rarely alone together. They had only talked to each other in the lightest strains upon the most casual subjects. Marie was always with them, walking by sea or moor, lounging on the terrace, lingering over the friendly tea-table, visiting the stables, driving, riding. Marie was as inevitable as Sibyl's shadow. Brandon might have thought that this perpetual companionship on Miss Arnold's part was in obedience to orders from Sir Joseph. But Sir Joseph's whole way of life was too unsophisticated to allow of such an idea. No, Sir Joseph trusted his guest, and it was for his guest to prove worthy of the confidence that had been so freely given. Brandon knew that he had been received on the strength of his race, warranted, trustworthy, as it were, because of the good blood that flowed in his veins, the gentleman's heritage of honour and self-respect. Not for all that this earth can give of happiness would he have proved himself unworthy of the good man's confidence. Thinking over that shadowing of Sibyl by Marie Arnold, he accounted for it to his own satisfaction as a sign of the elder girl's jealous attachment to her adopted sister. It must be jealousy, and only jealousy, which made Marie dog their footsteps and intrude her own personality upon every conversation, every small scheme of amusement. There were times when he could see that even Sibyl was annoyed by the elder girl's obtrusiveness. They could talk of no subject in which Marie would not take her part, sometimes talking sheer nonsense in her eagerness to join in their conversation. Whatever the feeling was which influenced this strong and passionate nature, it was a feeling that totally changed the girl's manner, and the change, in Brandon's opinion, was greatly for the worse. He could but compare the Marie Arnold of the present, vehement, excitable, dictatorial even, with the Marie Arnold of those quiet days before Sibyl's return. Then the dependent had been all gentleness, modest, retiring, given to thoughtful silence, rather than overmuch speech. Now she was loquacious, irritable, capricious, changing without apparent reason from exaggerated gaiety to sullen gloom, resenting unintended slights, exacting, pettish. To Brandon, the change became hourly more mysterious and more worrying. "You know Miss Arnold better than I do," he said to Urquhart one evening in the billiard room, "and perhaps you can tell me if she is often as disagreeable as she was to-day during our river excursion." In my sight, Marie Arnold can never be disagreeable. She is simply the loveliest woman I know, and the most fascinating." "I did not know you were so ardent an admirer. She is handsome, unquestionably, in a certain style. I can understand your admiring her. But I think you will admit that she has changed for the worse since Miss Higginson's return. Possibly. I dare say she feels her false position a little more keenly when Sibyl is at home." "You are pleased to talk of a false position. Really, I don't see where the falsehood comes in. Sir Joseph treats her with unwavering kindness." "Sir Joseph treats his collie dog with unwavering kindness. But do you suppose such a girl as Marie, conscious of the highest gifts a woman can possess, does not feel the difference between the acknowledged and the unacknowledged daughter, the heiress and the dependent?" "I don't think Miss Arnold, or any friend of Miss Arnold's, has the right to jump at conclusions upon such a subject as that," returned Brandon with grave displeasure. He liked, and even respected, Sir Joseph Higginson, and on that account alone was inclined to resent the insinuation that this girl, whose presence was an ostensible fact in the family circle, could be the offspring of some low intrigue. Much more did he dislike the idea that Sibyl's companion and friend should be a base-born sister, the inheritor of a mother's shame. "Perhaps, as Sir Joseph is a very good fellow, and a millionaire, the wisest course for all of us is to imagine his moral character stainless," Urquhart retorted, with an open sneer. "For my part, I'm inclined to think him human, and that his affection for Marie Arnold has its roots in an unforgotten love of his youth. I don't believe in abstract benevolence or adopted nieces." Suddenly, swiftly, it was borne in upon Brandon Mountford that this paradise along whose sunlit paths he had been wandering, lost in a dream of unquestioning bliss, was a paradise from which he must flee, and that, once having left Eden, those good angels, self-respect and honour, standing with flaming swords on either side of the gate, would forbid his return. He had been trusted in that household. He had been warned by implication against any attempt to win Sibyl's heart, and now he shrank, appalled, bewildered, yet overjoyed, at the thought that her heart was almost won. Yes, albeit they were so rarely together and alone, even for a few minutes, he had seen the signs of a growing interest in him and his life. He had seen the fair young face steeped in those sudden overwhelming blushes which tell of nascent love. He had seen Sibyl start at his footstep, beam with gladness at his approach. He had seen her intense interest in those stories of his travels, which he had told casually at first, and with a diffident apprehension of becoming a bore, but which both Sibyl and Marie had urged him to enlarge upon, and to not repeat once, but several times, stories of lions, stories of savage foes, stories of fever, stories of tricksters and card-sharpers at Port Natal, stories of buffaloes, lost or dead, of extinguished campfires. There was no detail of his adventurous wanderings in which those two listeners were not interested. "I feel like a modern Othello with a pair of Desdemonas," he said lightly, one afternoon as he was sculling lazily with the current, while Sibyl and Marie sat in the stern of the skiff, Sibyl holding the rudder lines, and then he quoted, almost automatically: "She loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them." "Oh, Sibyl," he cried, as the nose of the boat swung suddenly round, "what a jerk! Is that your idea of steering?" "I beg your pardon, Brandon. I thought that large barge was coming towards us." That barge was hugging the furthermost shore, about a quarter of a mile away. Brandon glanced at Marie, and was surprised at the angry light in the large dark eyes, surprised at the searching gaze which the elder girl fixed upon Sibyl's drooping eyelids and blushing cheeks. Chapter 9.